Wonderful. Well, hey, welcome everybody. It looks like we're at noon Eastern here, so we'll go ahead and jump in. I hope this finds all of you well and safe and healthy, and same, of course, for your families. Thank you so much for taking time out to join in the launch today of the Fall 2020 Ostrom Colloquium series. I'm Scott Shackelford, as I think all of you know. I have the honor of being the executive director of the workshop. And I can think of no better way, frankly, to launch our series this fall than with this particular talk by Michael, and as well as the project with Elizabeth and Andreas. I think you'll agree that it's very provocative, I think really helpful, and frankly, a bit of a goldmine for those of us interested in polycentric governance and how to dig into this field and make it more sustainable and useful across a whole range of fields. Just as a few quick reminders before I do a proper introduction, for Mike and the project. We are going to be having both the Colloquium and the research series fully online. It looks like at least through the first part of February, if not the whole academic year. So do remember that this Wednesday, for example, we have the first research series, which is going to be a really great roundtable of all the Ostrom fellows, as well as the research awardees talking about their work. So we hope you can tune in to that. And also, it's a busy fall because we're launching the new Governing the Commons program that Bill Blomquist is thankfully able to take on for us. And as part of that, we have a special Commons theme built into the Colloquium series, especially in the month of October. So that's kicking off with Frank Lehrhoven's Ostrom Memorial Lecture. Then thanks to Edu Brandizio and Bill, we have our Governing the Commons 30 years later special conference coming up the day after. And then the whole month of October then, building off of World Commons Week, is going to be dedicated to various questions of commons governance. So really excited about that lineup. So let's looking ahead to the fall there. So if you haven't already, please do register, in particular for the Governing the Commons 30 Years Later conference. But because it's a Zoom webinar, it's a bit of a different format, and you actually have to get the link once you register to be able to join in. So let us know if you have any questions. We're kind of new to the Zoom webinar things as well, but we'll make sure to get those answered. So that's coming up here. But as I said, today we're thrilled to launch this whole series with a man that needs no introduction, especially to this community. But I'll butcher your extraordinary CV, Mike. Okay, at least briefly. So Michael McGinnis, obviously a senior research fellow with the workshop, former director of the workshop, longtime collaborator with Lynn and Vincent, many others, is a former department chair, of course, of political science. Moved to Bloomington, I see here now, 35 years ago. A lot more time for fun stuff like golf these days, of course, since retiring, now an emeritus. I'm faculty member, but before that, had a whole various range of roles, including all the way up to associate dean before he retired. Today, Mike's going to be talking to us about some of his really, really groundbreaking, useful work, I think, in the realm of polycentric governance. What can make these systems more sustainable? Where do they fall short in the healthcare context and otherwise? So it's just such a pleasure, Michael, to have you with us and talking to us about this work. And per usual, please take as long as you feel is necessary up front here to tee up our discussion. And I'm happy to help moderate from there. So you can use the chat box throughout. I'll keep track. Feel free to use the raise hand function. That's an easy way to keep track as well of the lineup there. Or otherwise, just let me know and I can put you on the queue. So without further ado, over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Scott. I will say it is kind of strange making a presentation to the Ostrom workshop and not actually being in the Tocqueville room. But we'll try this out, and I think this will work pretty well. I'm very pleased that Scott was willing to let me start off the series this year, because polycentric governance is one of the key concepts of the Ostrom workshop. And so it's kind of an old idea, but we think we have some new take on it and some new questions. And thanks to Andreas, I think, came up with this. We have a new abbreviation. Well, you'll hear me use the word PG a lot when I get tired of saying polycentric governance. Shout out to Liz and Andreas, who are my co-authors. It really was their idea to start a project actually doing empirical a comprehensive review of empirical research, studying the potential performance of polycentric governance. And in this particular paper was kind of a sideline to that project, or to investigate a question that we thought hadn't really been looked at in the empirical literature. And as Scott said, it's basically how, in the title says, when is this kind of system going to be sustainable? Next slide, please, David. This concept was introduced to the literature back in 1961 by Vincent Ostrom, Charles Thibault, and Robert Warren. And that's 4 years before the Ostroms came here to Bloomington, so before the Bloomington School could have been established, and 12 years before the Ostrom Workshop itself was established in '73. The first definition here sort of shows their start with looking at metropolitan governance, where they saw lots of different centers of decision making that are able in some cities in the US to govern pretty well, and in other cities not so well. And so they really set this as a concept, as an alternative to the consolidationist argument that was being made pretty broadly back then, that all the government agencies within a metropolitan area should somehow be combined together into some mega council or something, or some big mayor sort of function. And their argument was that no, there's ways of doing this without getting that much of a unified structure. The second definition is from a paper Vincent wrote about the time they were putting together the Ostrom Workshop. And it has a nice summary of sort of the different components, the structural components of sort of many independent elements, but they're interdependent in terms of what they're trying to get accomplished. They're engaging in a process of mutual adjustment and ordering relationships with each other, and then generating a general system of rules and actually operating within a general system of rules. So it's a nice way to sort of bring those three pieces together. And the last one is one of the ones I really like. It's from Lynn's actually an interview that she did that really puts the highlight on the fact that this polycentric governance is something that citizens are able to use by draw upon resources from different governing authorities and making their own arrangements if that's necessary. And I'll come back to that point later. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a very brief set of findings from our literature review. Liz and Andreas, I hope are on the call so they can contribute here. There's a lot of interest in polycentricity. It did not exactly gather a lot of attention back in the 60s, but it's definitely starting to get more attention, especially after Lynn's Nobel Prize. These empirical studies acknowledge there's continuing challenges in terms of coordination and unequal access and lack of capacity. And most of the empirical research is still focused on descriptive analysis. Does an existing system sort of fit the definition, and does it show the kind of benefits that we would expect? Very little in terms of the evaluation, sort of a causal explanation of how these results are actually generated. And that's what we would really like to encourage, more self-conscious use of this concept as part of scientific, rigorous kind of analysis. And one of the things that's really missing is a lack of looking at what happens over time to a polycentric governance. How does it change over time? There are studies that look at how well it adapts to a changing environment, and that's a very important part, especially in the environmental literature, but very little on what happens internally and how these systems change over time, and how that will affect their ability to adjust to new circumstances in the future. And in fact, we looked through this and come up with a couple concerning trends that we think might lead to syndromes of dysfunctionality, if you will, that kind of emerge automatically out of this operation of a polycentric system that can be fixed, but it does take some sort of conscious effort to do that. And that's really what we're focusing on in this paper. Next slide, please. And here I'll remind you of what I said about Lynn's definition about citizens making use of jurisdictions or authorities that are available to them. And basically, we argue that polycentric governance takes a lot of different forms in different settings. In the EU, there's more common to talk about multi-level governance. In the public administration, it's usually collaborative governance or cross-sector network governance, marble cake federalism, regime clusters in IR, and nexus governance is kind of a cross-domain, cross-policy domain kind of argument that's starting to be made. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff out there, and eventually we hope to be able to survey all these literatures, but that's a big task. And so we're starting just with the ones that are talking about polycentric per se. And so this is very preliminary in that sense. Okay, next slide. Now finally the benefits. There's a lot of things that polycentric governance is supposed to be good for. Really started for Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren. It was about producing and providing public goods at multiple scales of aggregation within a metropolitan area, and doing that without necessarily having some top-down leader directing the whole process. For Lynn, polycentric governance plays a particular role in sort of setting the context for how local communities can govern themselves, whether they're given enough autonomy to manage their own resources, or given provide resources for communities who are seeking some kinds of help without losing control over their own destiny. In the environmental field, it's often a question of resilience to changing circumstances, and how it's important to fit the natural, the natural conditions of the environment to the kinds of institutions that you have. And this is a big theme, of course, in Lynn's work in governing the commons. But there's a fundamental sense in which, for Vincent in particular, he saw polycentric governance as very deeply connected to the logic of liberal democracy or classical liberalism from a philosophical sense. And this is a theme that our colleagues from the Mercatus Center, George Mason, have really been pursuing. Paul Glesia, Peter Bredke, and Vlad Tarko in particular, really making connections to the philosophical basis of classical liberalism. This is quite a mixed bag, and each of these kinds of benefits would require specific sorts of measures. I wish we could say we had a nice set of measures for those. We don't. There's various ways of trying to put those together. But what we're focusing more on trying to understand the nature of polycentric governance itself, and what are the components that make that up. And so if you go to the next slide, please, David. This is something that Mark Stefan and Graham Marshall and I put together for and supposed to be an introductory chapter to a volume edited by Andreas and Bill Bloomquist and Dustin Garrett on governing complexity, which came out. But our task was to put together a common definition of polycentric governance that could be used by everyone in the book. Well, we didn't quite pull that off because the three of us couldn't agree among ourselves what were the really critical components. And by the time we got around to having a draft to sort of share with everybody, they'd already written their chapters of the book. And so it was a nice idea, but it didn't quite work out the way we wanted. But we did come up with this list of 8 characteristics or dimensions of polycentric governance that are found in some polycentric systems, maybe all. We're not sure. We're not sure which ones of these are absolutely necessary and which ones can be sort of poorly satisfied or whatever. That's really a remaining question. And another point I want to make here goes back to one of Vincent's definitions I used earlier. We'd like to be able to separate the structures, the processes, and the outcomes so that we could do standard kinds of social science analysis. The structures determines the processes that occur. The processes interact with the structures to generate outcomes, and you can have dependent and independent variables and all those kinds of things. The problem here is that it sort of all fits together into one big endogenous dynamic, because for a system like this to be sustainable, the outcomes are going to have to reinforce the structural characteristics. They're going to have to allow the processes that have been driving that system to maintain operation. They've got to facilitate adjustment to changing circumstances. All those things have to sort of be happening. And so it's all one big sort of endogenous kind of mix. And that's what we're dealing with, is trying to get some understanding of how this would happen, or how this could sustain in different ways. So the structure, process, outcome thing, which seemed very promising, doesn't seem quite the right way to go. So we need another way of attacking this. So let me show you what we're doing. If Dave will go to the next slide for me here. We came up with this simplified model or representation of what happens in the process of self-organization. We say that a lot. There's a lot of steps involved. I won't go through the whole list here. It is a simplified list because in the real world, there would be a lot of cycling back and forth, false false leads, conflicting groups and subgroups operating across purposes and all that. But here's the basic sort of logic. And I want to highlight a few points. First, the groups have to kind of find each other with some kind of common interest. And then they have to engage in some conversation as to what are they going to do about solving a common problem or trying to achieve a common aspiration. How do they come together? And Vincent in particular, and Lynn also, like to use the word contestation, that they interact with each other in a way that is productive. I like to call it respectful contestation, because you're interacting with the other participants in a way to try to come to a solution that everybody benefits. You're not contesting over dominating the situation and taking over. And so there's this sense of respectful contestation that really defines the rules of the game that would occur, hopefully, in this kind of self-organizing process. And as we'll see in a little bit, that notion of respectful contestation kind of has limits and can sort of get undermined in various ways. Another thing that's really important in self-organization is not always considered, really shows up here in steps 4 and 5. One of the things they're going to talk about is, where are we going to get help? Where are we going to get assistance? Who's going to help us do the analysis? Who's going to help us implement the policy, enforce enforce the agreements and all that, enforce contracts, for example? Who's going to do that? And so there has to be this outward reach to other authorities. And so they're going to have to, as part of the process, sort of survey the existing institutional landscape and see what's out there, what kinds of resources are available to them. And that sort of creates an interesting situation, because sometimes what they're looking for isn't going to exist, and so they'll have to generate their own kind of organization, their own form of information, or develop their own resources, or their own organizational processes. And so a lot of the organizations that are part of this institutional landscape have themselves been created through processes of self-organization, and are there when that same group or other groups want to try to deal with another problem. And so here's this endogeneity thing coming again. Yes, it's a bottom-up process, and that's really what most people looking at polycentric emphasize. But a natural part of bottom-up organization is to establish and construct organizations that will make decisions and will implement policies and will coerce, and use legitimate forms of coercion. So top-down decision-making organizations are a natural consequence of these bottom-up kinds of organizations. So to understand polycentric governance, you really got to do both of these at the same time to again add to the complexity. Okay, next slide, please, David. In this slide, I don't want to get into too much detail, but we're trying to show here briefly, or suggest, how the 8 components or dimensions of polycentric governance kind of as a whole provide the raw material needed to do all those steps in self-organization that we just had. So just kind of imagine that 15-step process and these 8 dimensions, and there's multiple connections back and forth. You're going to need multiple sources of information. You're going to need places to get together to talk. You're going to need some shared values of what it means to be a team and to work together. And you're going to need mechanisms to resolve conflict. So you need all this to sort of sustain the process of going on. So let's see, what slide am I on now? So basically, one way to look at this is that the polycentric governance system provides resources for groups to organize themselves or to reach out to other organizations. So one way of looking at this is to look at the PG as an infrastructure for this problem of resource use, to form, to find, and to utilize resources relevant to collective action or self-organization. So it's kind of like a big common pool resource out there, which is why it sort of, I think, very sort of came to the mind of the Ostroms while they were doing this sort of thing. So in a way, if you look at polycentric governance as an infrastructure for resources that are available to a group of people, individuals, and groups within a society, not equally available to everyone, and there's rules on how different groups can use it and what they can get access to and all that. But that makes it kind of a common pool resource. And if that's what polycentric governance is, then we have to start thinking about, okay, who's maintaining the system? How is the system being maintained? This is where we get into, I think, a really interesting question, because that's not something that seems to be happening automatically in a bottom-up process. So, next slide, please. So we looked at, I started to think in terms here of, and we talked about it, the three of us, what kinds of things can go wrong drawing from different kinds of institutional theories. And what can make a system that's of resources that are supposedly available to all, how can some groups use those resources in ways that make it more difficult for other groups to get access to those some resources? In effect, that they would be degrading the quality of the resource or degrading the access of those resources to other players. And here's where there's a lot of different things that can kind of go wrong if you just allow this bottom-up organizing to operate sort of without any sort of constraint. And let me sort of go through these quickly. There's a lot in here. Transaction costs of self-organization process is always going to vary across groups, and sometimes the variation is going to be immense. Some groups find it really easy. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. They've got organizations easy. Some groups are very tough to bring together in the first place. And the trick here is realizing that that distribution, that variation, is itself going to be changed by the successful operation of collective action. When one group has successfully organizes, they get to do something better, but then they can in that way create power asymmetries. They can make it more difficult for other groups, maybe more important for other groups to organize, but also more difficult. And so the negative externalities here, if they're not dealt with in any sort of way, can kind of accumulate over time, and you get a system where only certain groups are able to extract the resources. And this gets even more difficult because when we realize that it's very easy to elicit biases in any sort of human group. It's very easy to generate a group of infeeling with members in a group and to sort of share biases about outsiders. And if you want to organize a group of individuals for collective action, it's often very useful to have an enemy, an opponent to sort of survive. I came at all this in a little different direction because I was trained more in international relations and conflict. So I naturally see conflict where Lynn and Vincent tended to see opportunities for problem solving. It's all sort of going on at the same time. But it's very easy for those biases to themselves be reinforced by collective action and to kind of permeate through the system over time. Okay. Because it's an institutional process. So path dependence is really critical. Those groups that have successfully organized change the opportunities available for later groups, including themselves. Okay. This rules of the game thing is kind of tricky because there's incentives to, you're competing, you're in some sort of a game and you're competing, but there's incentives to really want to win and to maybe go outside the rules to do that. And the more that happens, the more that the nature of the interaction changes from a game where everyone could potentially benefit from the interaction to a struggle for domination. And it's sort of a slippery slope to slide down into that. And then finally, you're drawing on other authorities. So you're going to have the opportunity of rent seeking or some sort of abuse of power when any sort of authority comes in. So you need to monitor that, and you need to understand what are the incentives for the authority. So all these pieces are kind of fitting in to the internal dynamics of the process. Okay. Here, I have to admit, is where I kind of have to wave my hands and skip more than a few steps. We threw all these tendencies and temptations into a pot, stirred them, if you will, and ladled out a serving of the 6 separate syndromes that will be on the next slide as soon as David lets you see it here. Okay, I can't go through all 6 of these. I'm already probably past the time that I need to present. But each one of these is sort of a combination of these processes that we're talking about. I've highlighted the incrementalism and scale mismatches because it's one where people using polycentric governance sort of arguments have always been kind of sensitive to the fact that, you know, it does tend to formulate, these systems are so complex, it can become difficult to get anything done. So incremental changes are much easier than big structural changes. It's easy to focus on short-term problems and to ignore the long-term consequences. So you get these temporal scale mismatches. And so that's sort of a natural sort of thing. And that's something that anyone studying polycentric governance has realized is a potential sort of weakness here. But there are these other things too. You can get into a situation where political leaders are using partisanship to sort of form the coalitions both within among the population, and the election campaigns get to be more about symbols rather than really problem solving. You can get this exclusion. Frankly, some of the current events have been sort of filtered into, you know, filtered through our minds as we were going through this. You can sort of bake, if you will, these biases can get baked into the system and get reinforced over time. And you can have a polycentric system that includes some very institutionalized structures. Vincent put a lot of emphasis on the founding fathers' design for the American Constitution as a polycentric governance. Well, we had slavery for hundred years. So, you know, and some critics have been arguing that was part of the system from the beginning. We just didn't, you know, Vincent certainly doesn't talk about that as part of it, but in a way it was a perversion of the basic notion of polycentricity because it only granted access to the full range of self-governing resources to white males initially, and then got expanded later on. And then of course, rent seeking and over centralization, and this hollowed out collaborative governance, some republic administration concern, government officials in search of trying to save money and lower taxes can, you know, farm out lots of their public tasks to private officials, whether they're firms or corporations or voluntary organizations, and they can kind of lose any sense that they're doing anything politically available. So anyway, there are probably many others of these. My co-authors didn't like when I had up close to 15 at one time. So we got it down to about 6. And on the next slide, I think you'll see where we're kind of at now. Dave, yeah, thanks. This middle column here is what I've just been talking about, how these things accumulate over time, a natural accumulation of tendencies, temptations, self-organization dynamics go through this. Markets reward short-term earnings, media cater to prejudices of audience, scientists maybe avoid. They know what's going to happen in the long-term consequences, but they don't want to directly get involved in policy because that's not how they get rewarded. So all that's sort of a natural thing and can lead to this particular syndrome. This is for only one of the 6 syndromes. We've got 5 other tables like this in the paper, although they're really very preliminary. On the right-hand side here is where the governance is taking place, where there are actions by citizens or by political leaders or by private organizations or professional organizations, associations, to try to protect the integrity of the system as a whole, okay? To try to minimize the accumulation of biases, or to try to require organizations or groups to consider the potential consequences of their acts on other groups, so to sort of take into account that some of the negative externalities, or to make sure that everyone has access to all the kinds of resources that are available. And so there's a whole slew of things that are going on here. And I think that a way to look at this is to think of those 2 tables as sort of operating at cross purposes, like 2 arrows working towards each other, and they're countervailing processes in effect. And in the middle, you get sort of the polycentric governance. For it to continue, it needs to maintain the kind of a dynamic tension between this bottom-up self-organizing processes and this governance. But it's not just a top-down governance, because it's the citizens looking at it too, and the other actors. So the governance is coming in from all over. It's a distributed form of citizenship, a distributed form of leadership that we're trying to understand how this relates into public governance. Okay, last slide for David. This is where we are. We still need to get some empirical indicators on all this. We've come up with some tentative warning signs to sort of see the emergence of some of these syndromes. There's a lot to sort of work on that. But it's not just a question of getting better measures. I mean, that's critical ultimately. But we also need to understand how these syndromes manifest themselves in different kinds of performance measures. How do each of these syndromes affect different forms of performance of the many systems? So there's a lot of different sort of pathways to be going there. And what does it mean to kind of have this creative tension, or this sort of, you know, Cinderella region kind of thing, where you're just in the right sort of process? And how do they interact, and all those in the countervailing forces? And then finally, we need to understand, what would it mean to have distributed governance? What would it mean to have that kind of a process of protecting the integrity of the system by sort of all the actors involved? And what would be the incentives that drive that and that make this possible, and get the bottom up and top down process? And then for the final sort of sentence in the paper, we think it's time to give the governance part of polycentric governance equal billing with its polycentricity. I'm done. Scott?
No, it's just fantastic. First off, round of applause. Virtually anyway, Mike. That was really, really excellent. And no, I'm glad you took a little bit of extra time to dig in, because there's so much there. I have several questions, but first we're going to turn to the participants, because there is a number coming in already, and we'll get through as much as possible. And it looks like, first off, and if you wouldn't mind maybe just introducing yourselves just briefly, that'd be great. It looks like we have Kirster Anderson first, and then we'll go over to Anis Malik after that.
Esther, good to hear from you.
Chris Anderson, I'm a professor of political science at University of Colorado, Boulder. Former student of Michael McGinnis.
You bet.
Thanks, Michael. I found this very useful, especially your proposed definition that distinguishes between the features, process, and outcomes. So one small suggestion on that one before I get to my actual question. I think it would be really useful to present that definition kind of in a graphic format as a figure, because as you noted in the footnote there to the slide, there's a lot of overlap between these categories, and there are feedback loops from the outcomes back to structure and process. So, you know, I saw kind of an IAD inspired figure there. So anyway, now to my question. So, you know, I like your recommendation that you had on one of the first slides of moving beyond just the descriptive studies of polycentric governance and trying to test PG, as you say, as an explanatory factor. I couldn't agree more, but you know, how? I'd like you to talk a bit more about what you see as the most important challenges in moving in that direction. I mean, I could see it's, as you know, it's kind of hard to measure polycentric governance objectively, and perhaps even more, or even harder to do it quantitatively. So, and I also sense that there are some epistemological challenges there that a lot of the people who study PG perhaps aren't too concerned about research design, causal analysis. Anyway, what do you think we should be doing, those of us who are interested in moving in that direction? And yeah, that's the question.
Esther, you always ask tough questions back in seminars, and so let me start with your observation about possibility of graphical representations. I encourage you to look at the book on governing complexity that I talked about, because Andreas, one of my co-authors and one of the co-editors of that, has a couple chapters in there where he actually tries to do some of that, okay? And tries to do some figures and tries to make the transition between structure, process, and outcomes in the way we use it there to dependent and independent variables and make that sort of connection. So I think that's a really important sort of good direction. My figures are usually not very understandable, so he does that much better. Your other question's a little deeper. let me say that one of the things about getting to know Lynn and Vincent pretty well was that you sort of saw the full range of their interests. Lynn was very important about doing a different kind of research, doing multidisciplinary research. In governing the commons, she had a very unusual kind of research project or research methodology for anyone to get a Nobel Prize from economics. I mean, that really was pretty strange, that kind of an inductive, empirically embedded sort of research would get recognition in the economics system. It's really pretty strange. There were no hypotheses in there. The research design was not really a research design in the way that it's normally taught in the classes. And ironically, I don't know who you took your approaches and issues to political science from, but Lynn used to teach that course, the introductory graduate seminar, as all about research design. And she was tough. And any, as you know, you worked with her, any student who came doing a dissertation, they had to have a really good, solid research design before she would schedule the defense. But the kind of research that the students were doing often looked more like the kind of research that Lynn was doing, which never would have passed a research design kind of thing. So there's a real kind of disjuncture here between what's the expectation of wanting to do social science research in a way that's compatible with the way the physical scientists do it, and the kind of research you need to do to understand the complexity of the way institutions affect the outcomes of political processes and economic processes. And there's a medium ground in there somewhere, and Lynn has found it because she did both, and she was able to do case studies in a way that resembled rigor, although it really wasn't rigorous in the same sense. Even though, and Lynn was constantly trying to come up with more sophisticated modes of doing, and there's a classic stage in governing the commons where she said she did all these statistical tests of all these measures she had of these cases. She tried to, correlate this from that. She couldn't find anything. And then finally she got this intuition that there was a different way of looking at it. And that's how she came up with the design principles that kind of put together. So there's something in the middle there that is really hard to get your mind on, but it's where we need to be if we recognize that these structures can't have the effects on the outcomes that we want them to have unless the people and the institutions they're using to take advantage of those structural opportunities also are trying to generate those outcomes, and they're doing it in a way that sustains that. So it's a very interactive kind of thing. Lynn used to talk about the configurable effect of variables, and that's really where I think we are. So we need to follow Lynn's example and try to find good measures. You did a lot of the IFRI stuff, I think, at one point, the forestry stuff, and to do that, but to also think in terms of thinking through a different way of doing kind of rigorous analysis. And you're one of the people who can do that, so keep it up.
Excellent.
Scott, you may want to take more than one question at a time, or I'm going to run out here.
No, this is great stuff, though. No, wonderful. And yeah, next we have Ines, and then Jess, and then I'll throw in a few from the chat box after that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike. It's really great to see you. This is Anas Malik.
Great to see you too.
Former student of Mike's and Vincent and Lynn's also. And I'm trained as a behavioralist social scientist, but I've the last 10 years, 15 years have been all steadily heading more in the direction of epistemological questions.
You have indeed.
Well, what I'll say is, I mean, you might be able to guess where these. I'll just say three very quick things that occur to me. One comes squarely out of a quote from Lynn. I can't remember. It's probably in that book on the kind of survey of institutional analysis with Princeton Press. I can't remember the name of it, but she basically says that that civilization is non-zero sum thinking. That the move from zero sum to non-zero sum thinking is the move to civilization. Right? So the first question is, to what degree is the viability or sustainability of PG dependent on non-zero sum thinking or a certain prevalence of it? The second part, as I'm sure you'll be able to guess, Mike and others who know my work, is is to what degree is it reliant on a worldview that, or a cultural training or a metaphysical attachment that emphasizes the obligation to consider the other, the sense of covenant, which Tocqueville talked about, and Vincent was his last book is all a warning about the loss of that sense of obligation. And then the final one is that I'm a little troubled, or maybe troubled is the wrong word. I want to perturb you in the same way that I hope Vincent would have done, maybe, if which is that we're talking about this kind of Cinderella zone. You use that phrase, but isn't cyclicality and kind of ebb and flow part of the nature of the dynamic? And the reason I'm thinking of this is specifically Ibn Khaldun's idea of solidarities that emerge and then disintegrate. And there's a transition through ecological niches. And so I wonder if some sense of that, I've always thought, can that be integrated into an overarching system that remains open, but also resilient and doesn't fall apart? Can we sustainably have, this kind of rise and fall of competing solidarities? And I love the lists that you've got. I want to pore more carefully over the typologies, but those are the three things, and great to see you. Yeah.
Great to see you too, Anas, and it's the first time I've heard the phrase Ibn Khaldun for a while since I'm dealing with Vincent, and I was your last question in particular got me to think about a response that Vincent often got when someone was giving a presentation and he asked a question for a while, and the answer was the first question. Could you repeat the question? That last one was tough. Okay. Let me talk about the non-zero sum. I think that's absolutely critical. And that's embedded in this rules of a game sense of respectful contestation, that you have to, you're competing, you're trying to win, but you're also respecting the other side's right to survive and to have their values respected and their interests respected. And somehow that's got to be, I don't know, it's got to be baked into the personalities of the individuals pursuing. One of Lynn's themes that hasn't gotten as much attention as the rest of her work is the focus on civic education, the importance of teaching things like collective action and effective collective action as a critical part of civic education. It's not just finding the name of your congressman and being able to write letters to them or to know where the polling places are and stuff like that. It's, how do you engage with people that share some values very close to yours, but who have some very different opinions, and how do you work together? And that's absolutely critical, and polycentric governance is critical in that, and it's not survivable without that. And that's a point that that Paul Gleasia has kind of taken up in some of his work, especially his book on connecting the Ostrom's works to pragmatism and that, of seeing the sense that polycentric governance has to somehow help generate values or establish value systems in the next generation and give them experience in these processes and reinforce this in some way. So it's very much getting out of the non-zero sum mentality. And I think that covers some of your second kind of point too. I can't quite figure out my notes here, what I said, but we can talk later.
Yeah, we will.
This will just be, I think, the start of several long conversations, which is great. But yeah, no, just in the interest of time, we have Jess next, and then I'll interject with some points that Franz was making in the chat box, and then move on to Jamie. So Jess, please.
All right, cool. Can you all hear me? Make sure
Yes.
that okay,
Perfect.
great, cool. Well, Mike, I really appreciated this. And I want to ask you what, I apologize if it might be kind of an asinine question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is one of the things that's both interested me and frustrated me about this, about sort of polycentrism in general, is it's never been quite clear to me exactly what the scope conditions are on it. Especially if we sort of think about the fact that I think it was Franz maybe that brought this up about the idea that we're really talking about systems and complex systems. And what we know about complex system is often a function of our methodology and what we decide to include as opposed to actual characteristics of the system itself. And if that's the case, how can you help us think about what the actual scope conditions are on on sort of defining and measuring polycentric systems? I mean, I can really, we could all sort of agree probably the top-down single domain structures are not, or maybe outside of what we think of as polycentric systems. But given that they are, as you point out, often called networked or have characteristics of complexity, then it seems like the lens or the frame in which you are approaching the system really determines the characteristics of it. And that seems especially true of polycentric governance, which has always made it difficult for me to wrap my mind about where the contours are around it. And so I apologize. That again, that might be kind of an asinine question.
No, Jessica, that's a great question and a tough one, another tough one. And I've struggled with that lots of times. I've been working on this for so long that I start to see polycentric governance everywhere, and you can tell that with that list of its aliases, and it occurs in lots of different forms. And I really don't believe there's ever been a monocentric system in quite the way Vincent used to contrast. There's nothing that's totally monocentric. And in a polycentric system, you're going to have little islands of tyranny or little islands of top-down behavior. Markets have firms, right? I mean, it's like part of the, and I think it's part of the system. But let me give you an example, one of the things that I initially had in this, the first draft of this paper, and that my co-authors fortunately encouraged me to take out. And that's that, what do you say of a system a constructed polycentric system, okay? Say you're the leader of a autocratic regime, okay? And one of your primary problems is trying to stay in power because there are other people out there who would like to take your place. And so one of the things you do is you start building a spy, you build national security and domestic security apparatus, okay? In order to track information or whatever. Well, you can't just have one of those, because then you become dependent, like on the J. Edgar Hoover kind of stuff. You become dependent on that guy. So you come up with multiple versions of spies, and you have the spies spying on each other, okay? And what you have there is the kind of intelligence gathering system and security apparatus that you found in Nazi Germany, that you found in Soviet Russia, you found under the, in Germany, it was really driven by the Führer, the individual leaders at the top. In the communist Soviet Union, it was supposed to be so that there was a committee on top, there was a Politburo on top. Under Stalin, it was Stalin, but I mean, the Politburo. So is that part of the system, that intelligence sort of community or security community within an authoritarian government? Can you look at that as a polycentric system? I mean, it's got lots of overlapping authority, lots of agents, lots of different ways to draw all sorts of powers. I mean, but it's in the service of very clearly non-liberal aims or non-democratic aims. And so I think, and Andreas has brought this up too, that the polycentric governance, the way we're using it, really only kind of fits if you're talking about liberal democratic societies. That it may not be a good fit. I mean, yes, you can say that looks like a polycentric system for those intelligence operations, but it's not. And do you define it out or not? I mean, that's sort of an interesting question. One last sort of point on this is that Scott referred to this in his introduction to me. I've been working on health policy, US health policy system for a while, trying to first argue it is a system rather than just chaos. Is that polycentric? Sure looks polycentric, but it has none of the positive benefits that a polycentric system is supposed to have, okay? It's got all kinds of institutional diversity, but it just does not provide equitable access to resources by any stretch of the imagination. And I would argue that every damn one of the syndromes I had, maybe even all 14 or 15 in my earlier draft, are in the health policy system. So it's not a polycentric system or not. Or is it just a poorly performing or terribly performing, or a pathological system of polycentric governance. That boundary question, that definitional question, is a really tough one, and we and anyone else studying these objects are going to have to come to terms with. But there's something, I think, deeply connecting the idea of polycentric governance and how it could work and the basic values of liberal democracies in multicultural, diverse, homogeneous, or heterogeneous societies. Paul Gleash has made a lot of that point. I know Andreas is thinking along those terms too. So, not a stupid question. Very, very good question. Andreas, I see you smiling over there. Are you ready to jump in? Nope, he's not.
Happy to get on the queue, Andreas. That's no problem. Just really quick, Mike, related to that point, you know, in the internet governance context, that got me thinking as well, because Russia, for example, is on the record for pushing for what they even called a polycentric system of internet governance. But what they mean by that, as far as I can tell, is a system not dominated by kind of Western democracies. So as we think about the use of this term in different contexts, including cyberspace, I really liked your discussion of state reinforced self-governance and kind of where some of this falls short, right? Especially in thinking about more sustainable systems that could be more equitable. So
I want a reference to that, Scott.
Oh, done. And I'd love to have a much longer conversation with you about that, because like I said, I found all of this just really, really helpful. But just in terms of the list, Franz, you had several chats there that we can return to if you would like. Feel free to jump in if you prefer. I can paraphrase as well. Franz might have stepped away. I'll paraphrase really quick. So Franz was asking what some of the reasons were, and you kind of referenced this a bit, Mike, for why you focused on the challenges of polycentric governance rather than just the opportunities, maybe because those are better or at least more deeply investigated. And then he was also asking, he was making reference to a post-normal science as potentially a useful methodology to look to in thinking through these complex systems. So if you wanted to respond to either of those, please feel free, and then we'll turn to Jamie and Brian.
Just real quickly, Lynn actually has a book where she talks about post-positivist science, and so that might be very close to what he's talking about, post-normal science. So Lynn knew there was this tension in her own work. And yeah, and you're quite right that I focused on the challenges, partially because I've been working on health policy, and I haven't seen anything really good in any of these sorts of things sort of working out. And I'm coming out of the workshop tradition where there has been this sense that polycentric governance is normatively desirable and very effective in lots of different circumstances. And, you know, and I've just been trying to find a limit on understanding where it works and where it's not going to work. So I think that comes in. But I think we're going to hear from Franz not too long, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yes. No, that's right. That's
He's
right.
giving the talk on 30 Years of Commons, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. He's part of our special event there, which is
You know,
going to be
you got to publicize these events, Scott. You know.
No, we do. We do. In fact, I'll put that in the chat box. No, you're absolutely right, Mike. Just in case anybody hasn't registered for that, because yeah, it's quite the all-star lineup. So that's going to be awesome. Excellent. So just in the interest, again, we only have about 5 minutes, so we'll do a little bit of a lightning round. Jamie, if you'd like to propose your question, and then Brian, maybe we'll just do both those back to back, and Mike can respond as he'd like.
Sure. Mike, I'm actually glad you brought up this idea of Stalin and this question of, is there polycentricity underneath Stalin? Because that made me think about this idea of power, which is where I think like this idea of polycentricity like attempts to address. Are you all going to explore the role of power in your own research?
Yes. And it's a great question.
The lightning round.
It's one of the things that the Ostrom approach has been most commonly criticized for not dealing with power. And looking at it in this way that we're developing here, they're not going to be able to say that anymore, because the structures of power are emerging out of this process as it generates in the bottom-up structures. Bottom-up processes can generate very deep structures of asymmetric power. And we can attack that. So yeah, we're working I'm working with Dan Cole on another paper that's looking at power. but I've always felt that was a wrong criticism. Not wrong in the sense that Lynn and Vincent don't talk a lot about. Well, Lynn doesn't talk about power and repression and things like that, but it's not intrinsic in the approach.
It is kind of there. Like I noticed it in Vincent's article, Artisanship and Artifact. Yeah, he is definitely talking about that.
Vincent's coming out of the classical liberalism tradition, so he's very concerned about the abuse of power in a way that Lynn didn't really in most of her research. I think you said Brian was next.
Exactly. Yep. But those are great points. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay. Yeah. You know, reading this, I mean, the partisanship stuff makes me think about, okay, well, what happens, you know, next year after the election, and assuming, you know, a positive outcome. But maybe to make it more specific, if you say, okay, that polycentric system didn't work, like healthcare, and you're ready to drastically reform it, and you've got the political coalition, so you can do major reforms. Like, you know, how do you think about, okay, do we want just a pure, you know, bureaucratic top-down control of delivery, or do you still want to keep some elements of, you know, choice, polycentricity in reforming healthcare? How would you think about that kind of issue in the context of major reform?
Brian, I'll be sure to give you a brochure when I write my book on health policy. That's exactly what I'm going to have to try to do. I initially started that project to try to, you know, because Lynn and I started a project on health commons in the last couple of years of her life, and looking at the health system as sort of a commons, and that was one way of looking at it. Okay, I think it's better to look at it as an imperfect system of polycentric governance, or maybe a totally dysfunctional system of polycentric governance. But then that raises the question, so what do you do next? And that's an open question, and it's one that I'm hoping after this project, Andreas and Liz and I are able to take this project a little further and get a way to sort of use it to apply in some actual circumstances, to take some insights from that and apply it to what makes sense for health policy, or general sorts of reforms in particular. We've got a lot of other major reforms that we need to have in this country. The race relations has really come to the fore lately, and the general denial by certain officials about climate change is generating huge problems. And so those are all major, big sorts of things. But, you know, it doesn't make sense to leap all the way to the other side and then have a totally top-down sort of arrangement. The solution has to be somehow compatible with the incentive of the actors who are going to have to run that system in the future. And I do think that the incentives of politicians now in the partisanship, the way the system's set up, is deeply dysfunctional, and leads to the political leaders to lose their sense of politics as being the art of compromise, and see it instead as the art of keeping your extreme supporters happy, and by not compromising. And that's, you know, that's just totally inconsistent. But those are big questions. And but, you know, democracy, liberty requires constant vigilance. I think
On that note,
Goldwater, I don't know.
yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's fantastic, Mike. And as Dew said in that chat box as well, social media in a lot of ways is just widening these divides. So a lot of these debates around disinformation, having an informed electorate, learning from other examples, which I'm sure you're doing in your book project, how other healthcare systems might be more successfully polycentric. There's a lot of ways that we can take these conversations, and I look forward to continue to having them. So first off, another round of applause for Professor Mike McGinnis. Thank you so much for that fantastic work. We look forward to continuing to follow it. As a little reminder on, we're doing something a little bit different with the research series this year. So we're going to still be having opportunities, of course, for the Ostrom Fellows and the doctoral students to present, but we're also including updates from our working groups and the Polycentricity Working Group, which if you're not already a member of, I encourage you to join, is going to be giving their report on Wednesday, October 14th. So that's going to be another chance to learn about all the different facets of polycentricity research happening throughout the workshop community. And there's also a special Ostrom book club series that we're launching as part of the Wednesday research series. So that's going to be a lot of fun as well. And that's going to be kicked off by Lisa Ansler and Janet Martinez on the 28th. For the Colloquium series, next Monday, we're lucky to welcome William Weinkoff and Sarah Dansman, and then Frank Leerhoven on the 28th to help us kick off World Commons Week and the Governing the Commons Conference, which if you haven't already registered for, remember to do that. That's the following day. So thanks so much again for joining us. If there is a silver lining for not being able to be all together in person, it's that we're able to welcome people all around the world, more than 60 on the line, which is fantastic. So thanks so much again for taking the time. Fantastic discussion. And thanks again, Mike.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Take care.
Good day.
Thanks. Stay safe. Yep.